Good morning also from my side. Thank you very much, Dr. Neubar, for inviting me. It is a great privilege to talk here. The topic of my today's talk will be a brief introduction into the endocannabinoid system, into this fascinating signaling system in our bodies, and this will probably or hopefully help us understand what happens in our bodies when cannabinoids enter. So unfortunately, this field is still fraught with many myths and misconceptions about the plant, its bioactive molecules, and everything around it. So I'm really grateful to events like this because I truly believe that education is the only way that is going to get us out of these myths and into scientifically based conversations about this plant and its active ingredients. So just a brief word, I'm coming from the Institute Canna. Dr. Neubar already kindly introduced me, and just a few words on the Institute. The Institute Canna, or International Institute for Cannabinoids, is based right here in Ljubljana, and we started with the Institute several years ago, trying to connect experts working in this field, trying to create an environment where a scientific debate could be started about these molecules, hopefully inspire or spark off some changes in legislation that would make medical use and research possible. Here we are still unfortunately lacking behind, but doing our best. So okay, let's start with the endocannabinoid system. So our bodies are quite amazing and extremely complex. We have many systems in our body that are working together. We have naturally many organs, and if we take a look, if we would zoom into the organs and look at individual cells, we would see that cells under a microscope look very differently. So if we take a look at a skin cell, it looks very different from a hepatic cell, it looks very different from a neuron, it looks very different from a muscle cell. But the basic idea is that, albeit we have such a huge diversity in cells and in their morphology and also specific functions, the basic setup, the basic biochemical setup of a cell that is like a basic unit of our bodies looks something like this. And biochemically speaking, all the cells have quite a few things in common. If we would take a look at what it would look like if we would travel inside of our bodies and zoom in on a single cell, it would look so this spherical structure, these are cells, and if we would take one apart, we would see the membrane around the cell. This is the cell nucleus. These are specific organelles like Golgi apparatus, like endoplasmic reticulum, and these little brown things, they are mitochondria. And please remember these ones because I will return to these towards the end of the topic because it seems that they are rather important also in cannabinoid and the endocannabinoid system. So if we imagine that we have about 35 trillion cells in our bodies, they have to communicate quite extensively with each other to enable our cells, our tissues, our organs, and the body as such to work properly and in coordination. And the way people hopefully, or I'm hoping ever better, communicate in a family, in a society, and the communication is the basis of good functioning, it is very much alike also in our bodies. For our body to function properly, our cells have to communicate with each other. And actually our cells are highly talkative. They talk to each other all the time. They tell each other what's going on with them, what chemicals they are producing, what they want, how much energy they need, what they want their neighbors to do. They are quite chatting a lot. And the way they chat is actually not the way we are used to, but they send signaling molecules, tiny or larger chemical molecules that actually send signals and enable one body. For example, it enables the stomach or the intestine to communicate with the brain, albeit they're not so close. And these molecules enable the entire body to function in coordination, to talk, to exchange information, to enable this communication. And the reason why I'm explaining this is because cannabinoids are also signaling molecules. They actually function in our body primarily as a signaling molecule. They do many other things as well, but their basic function is as signaling molecules. And in a basic signaling setup, we have a cell that is producing the signal, so it's trying to say something. And on the other hand, we have cells that are target cells that are able to receive the signal, and cells that are not able to receive signals. In terms of when we're talking about cannabinoids, very few cellular types are not target cells. Vast majority of cellular types in our bodies have cannabinoid receptors and receive this signal. Actually, the least cannabinoid receptors we have in the parts of our brain, in the brainstem, we have where breathing and heart rate is regulated. But even there are cannabinoid receptors, albeit their density is not very high. And the basic idea is, so this would be a cell, that what it looks like if we kind of plastically imagine. So this spherical thing is a cell, and this what is popping out of the cell are receptors. There are many different types of receptors that enable a cell to sense what is going on. The way that it's for human beings vital that we see what is going on around us and respond to these changes. If we imagine a traffic situation, it's very vital that we notice the changes very fast and respond to these changes. For the cell, it's very much the same story. For a cell to function properly, to be in coordination in a tissue or in an organ, it's vital that they sense changes in pH value, in pressure, in concentration of different nutrients, and respond to these changes. And receptors are exactly the molecules that enable these cells to sense changes around them and respond. So now this would be a cell, and a part of receptor is always on the outside, sensing and detecting changes, and the other part of the receptor is on the inside of the cell, telling the cell what's going on outside. And the idea is that these receptors enable the cell to sense this and take this message into the inside, and then a very complex cascade of biochemical reactions happen. Don't worry, we'll not go into the details of this. But this is just to give you an idea. So when a change happens on the outside, the receptor gives this information to the cell, and it enables a very complex cascade of biochemical reactions, giving the cell the opportunity to make changes in the nucleus and respond to this change. And if we imagine, if we take a single cell in our bodies at this right moment, in each cell about 10 to 15,000 biochemical reactions are happening at each given moment. So if we imagine a cell, it's everything but static. There's a whole lot going on in each cell. And all of these biochemical reactions are very tightly regulated and very well coordinated with each other. The reason why I explained all this is that it gives us a better understanding in the functioning of the cannabinoids, because the cannabinoids do exactly this. So they're signaling molecules that bind to receptor and enable the cell to respond to the different concentration of cannabinoids. What kind of cells are the ones that are responders? So basic principle is that these are the cells that have cannabinoid receptors. Today we have very well known two types of cannabinoid receptor, the CB1 and the CB2. Now it is already fairly well accepted that the GPR55, a general cellular receptor, is also a cannabinoid receptor and is sometimes also termed as a CB3 receptor because it is very sensitive to cannabinoids. And then there's also other receptors that respond to cannabinoids, and not just single receptors but whole receptor families. For example, the thermoterpe family of channels is also responding to cannabinoids. But then, to make the story more complicated, there are also ways that the cannabinoids function that is completely independent of the receptors. So the whole functioning of the cannabinoids, the way we see in science and also in clinical practice, is quite complex. It's not just that they come and they do one tiny things the way we are used to with the other pharmaceutical agents. The mode of functioning of these molecules is fairly complex. The cannabinoid receptors are also similar in the fashion that I described before. So there's one part of the receptor on the outside cell and the other part in the inside of the cell. And if we look at where we have them in our bodies, the CB1 receptor is located primarily in the brain and in the central nervous system, and the CB2 receptor is more uniformly distributed in our bodies and in our tissues. And if we look at the highest density, we find it on the surface of the immune cells. Already this distribution tells us that the molecules that are activating CB1 receptor are going to function or have very different physiological responses than the ones that are activating the CB2 receptor. Now, certain part of the brain regions have a very high density of cannabinoid receptor, and when this was actually found, this triggered the idea or the hypothesis that maybe we have our own cannabinoids that are binding to these receptors, because our bodies and our cells are very economic and they do only things that make a lot of sense. And when brain regions were found that have more cannabinoid receptors than any other receptor type, it was very unlogical that our body would go through so much trouble, produce so many receptors for cannabinoids, when the chances are that we're going to encounter cannabis are, well, for some people, it's more, for some people less, but there's a very wide population that will never be exposed to cannabinoids, so why would our bodies bother to produce so many receptors? And then the hypothesis came about that maybe these receptors do not serve phytocannabinoids, but rather serve our own molecules. And of course this hypothesis was proven, or it is now a standing fact that our bodies produce our own cannabinoids called the endocannabinoids, and they don't just produce molecules that are similar to THC but CBD, but also a wide range of other molecules that are endocannabinoids. And they bind, of course, to the same receptors. This I find a very interesting story. Cannabis historically has been used medically and for diverse rituals, and this idea that cannabis is promoting a good feeling or this general well-being has been very well postulated throughout history. And a group of experiments showed this very plastically, how we feel has to do with cannabinoids. Namely, scientists found that we have brain regions that respond very strongly to positive stimulation. So they took a group of 20 young healthy men and they made them 2-minute-long movies with their favorite movie stars, of very emotional, positive movie scenes, and they looked at what is going on in their brain. And very specific brain regions lighted up very strongly when they were looking at these movies. And they were not funky movies, they were really nice movies. And when they analyzed these brain regions, they found that there's extremely high density of cannabinoid and opioid receptors in these brain regions. So this response to positive stimuli actually produces endocannabinoids. They bind to these regions, and that's why these brain regions light up. And this was actually the first kind of anatomical plus biochemical link between what good feelings have to do with the endocannabinoid system or cannabinoids in general. And of course, if we bring into our bodies cannabinoids from outside, these same brain regions can potentially light up. Okay, so if we take a look at closer what would be going on in neurons in terms of the endocannabinoid system and the cannabinoids, so we have the presynaptic neuron and the postsynaptic neuron and this synaptic cleft. Cannabinoids, albeit they are signaling molecules, they have a few specificities of what they do, of how they differ from other signaling molecules, and one of them is that, so usually the signal between neuron cell travels in this direction, but cannabinoids are actually retrograde signaling molecules. They are produced in the postsynaptic cell, and they travel and bind to receptor on the presynaptic neuron and actually modulate what this cell does and not what the downstream cell does. And these same receptors are activated regardless if we produce cannabinoids endogenously or if we bring into our bodies cannabinoids from outside. So this is to have a little closer look. So the main difference is that these signaling molecules send the signal upwards, These molecules are degraded very fast. This is one of the reasons why it took quite a long time for scientists to discover them, because they are present in low concentration and they degrade very fast, so it wasn't an easy task to prove that they exist. And they function very locally, so they're not like hormones that they're produced somewhere and travel around the body in a significant concentration and they do something. They're produced very locally where they're needed, and then they do their signaling, and then they're degraded fairly fast. Now to have a look at these two of the phytocannabinoids that are maybe best known. So this is the THC and the CBD, and we have our own close analogs in our own body. So this is the anandamide, that is kind of an analog to the THC, and the 2-AG, that is an analog to the CBD. And if we look at these planary chemical structures, they don't look very similar. But we're not talking about chemistry. Our bodies are biological things, and they function in a 3D structure. And if we put these molecules in a 3D structure, they have a part of the molecule that is in a very similar 3D structure. And because receptors and their molecules function like key locks and keys, they fit together. And this is why anandamide and THC and 2-AG and CBD can activate the same receptor, because part of the molecule has a very similar 3D structure. And so our endocannabinoid system has been postulated to be the receptors, the endocannabinoids, and the enzymes that produce and degrade the endocannabinoid system. And even when we had this notion of the endocannabinoid system, it was quite hard to explain what exactly this endocannabinoid system does, because each cellular system, each cell type was studied. There was found an effect of the endocannabinoid system on the cell type or on the body system. And then Dr. Meshulam and Vincenzo Di Marzo postulated that the endocannabinoid system affects primarily, but not exclusively, 5 of the most vital functions in our body. So this would be appetite, the circadian rhythm, the possibility of muscles to relax and contract the way it is needed, to remember the things that are vital and forget. So the memory center of the brain is highly affected, and it comforts a general protective function in our bodies. Maybe the best way to describe what it does from a cellular point of view, we know that cells are very dynamic and very active, but majority of parameters in a cell has to be very tightly regulated. So we know that the pH value has to be very tightly regulated, the temperature, the natrium values, everything is within a certain limit. And whatever happens in our cells that takes us out of this optimal balance, we have this endocannabinoid system that is activated upon this and activates different biochemical pathways to get us as soon as possible back into balance. And this is what we call homeostasis. So whenever our cells are out of biochemical homeostasis, we have the endocannabinoid system. Cannabinoids are produced, they cause their signaling, and they try to get our cells, as basic units of our body, as soon as possible back into balance. Albeit already this story is quite complex, it seems that there is more to it. There's a very interesting findings have been found that not only this communication that happens between cells in our body, but also the communication that happens inside of a single cell is highly important, and also under the influence of cannabinoids. So, as I showed you previously, you saw that a cell is also quite complex. It has many organelles, and in order for one single cell to function properly, these organelles also have to communicate with each other. And it is very well known that primarily the cell nucleus has to communicate very well to other organs. In cases when this communication is not functioning properly, this was already linked to several pathologies and several, especially chronic diseases. And one of the most important communication is happening between the cell nucleus and the mitochondria. I told you these little brown guys were important. And Dr. Sinclair studied very well the differences between young cells and older cells. They studied aging and found that there's a very specific molecule that is present in high abundance in young cells and very scarce in old cells, and this is the NAD. And it was actually found that in young cells, this is the communication molecule between the cell and the mitochondria. And you can imagine the mitochondria is like a powerhouse. So the mitochondria provide ATP, that is the energy for the cell to function. And this is like how should we say, this is like the general, the nucleus is something like the boss. So it decides, or depending on what genes are active and not active, it decides what the cell is going to do and which functions not. And in order for the cell to do all that, it of course has to have enough supply of energy. And the communication between the two, that the cell has enough energy to do what the nucleus wants to do, and that the mitochondria knows what the nucleus wants to do, is very important. And Dr. Sinclair, in a very cute way, explained that the nucleus and the mitochondria in a young cell are something like young lovers. They tell each other everything important, all their dreams, what they're wearing, everything. They spend on the phone all the time, so they have a feeling they know everything about each other. And it's in a similar way, the mitochondria knows exactly what the cell wants to do, and it can supply the energy when needed, and vice versa, the nucleus tells the mitochondria what it's going to do. And in a young old cell, this is something similar like an old married couple. Why bother telling him, he's not listening anyway. So eventually, many years down the stream, the one doesn't know anymore what the other wants, the other can't supply the energy because he doesn't have a clue what this one is doing, and we're starting to grow apart, or the cells are starting to age. And he did very interesting experiments with mice where he injected mice that would be something equivalent to a 60-year-old human being with NAD to the level appropriate for a 30-year-old person, and the mice actually cellularly and in terms of biological age became much younger and started to function like young cells. So this is quite fascinating finding, that this intracellular communication is also very important, and it seems that cannabinoids play a very important role here as well. So the mitochondria are highly fascinating little organelles. I could go for hours on them because they're highly fascinating, but in terms of our talk, maybe it's just important that you know that everything that we eat that has to be turned into energy actually goes into the mitochondria and is produced into ATP. So they serve something like little powerhouses that supply energy. But they do a lot of other things as well. So the mitochondria have two membranes. And on the outer membrane, it was found that CB1 receptors are actually present and embedded into this outer membrane. CB2 receptors have not been found in the mitochondria, but it has been found that when a CB2 receptor is activated on the surface of the cell, the communication or the signal actually travels into the mitochondria, and through signaling of the mitochondria, the cells respond to this CB2 activation. So cannabinoids actually are very important. So it was proven that CB1 receptors are present on this membrane, and the activation of these CB1 receptors on the mitochondria also have a very important role. So this would be a lipid bilayer that's on the cell surface or the membrane, and also within the mitochondria, and these are molecules that are lipid that can travel through, and it was found that cannabinoids, even when they don't bind to cannabinoid receptors, you can see that these lipid bilayers are also not static. They're always in motion. And this fluidity of the membranes on the organelles and on the cells are very important. And it seems that cannabinoids affect how fluid these membranes are. And this has a consequence for many things. So besides having a function to bind on the receptors, they can modulate organelles and cells based on how they affect this fluidity of the membrane. And shortly I will just describe what is also extremely important in terms of cannabinoids, the mitochondria, and what they do in our bodies. And this is called calcium signaling. Calcium signaling is also a signaling mechanism. It's a biochemical pathway how cells also send messages. Cannabinoid is bound on the receptor. It actually causes a raise in the cellular calcium, and this causes also downstream reactions. You can see that when we measure the concentration in a cell, peaks like this happen, and how high these are and how broad these peaks are, it tells the cell what to do, which gene to express, what to do. So the cells are very cautious on keeping the calcium level in the cell very low, and then in response to something, elevate this calcium and then get it back down very soon. So they have a ton of mechanisms to keep this calcium level in a homeostatic range. This is a movie that will show you how this signaling happens. You will see in the beginning, so these things are little, are individual cells in a cell culture, and you will see that the cell that starts with the calcium signaling will light up very brightly yellow towards white. And then you will see how this signal actually spreads. This is how a cell will send out the calcium signal. It goes in kind of a wave way, and this is how they send this signal outwards. And the reason why this is also highly fascinating in terms of neurology is because it offers us another piece of understanding, maybe why cannabinoids can help with different neurological conditions, especially seizures. There was a study done that studied hippocampal nerves, and when they added a certain very specific blocker, a channel blocker, they could produce these spikes that are very similar to epileptiform spikes of calcium that are present before a seizure. So this is like an experimental model in cells of neurons. And when they added CBD, so when they added this blocker, induced this change, and then added CBD, you can see that this epileptiform really reduced and became very less significant. And even more so, if they added CBD prior to this calcium blocker, meaning prior to inducing this epileptiform changes, this was even further reduced and comes almost to a normal curve of calcium. And this could be one of the ways that maybe can help us understand what CBD does in terms of epileptic seizures. And then it was also found that CBD confers quite well to neuroprotection in generally. And here also one very interesting finding was seen. So if we take a normally excited cell, so a cell that is basically in resting, and we add CBD, we see a slight increase in calcium. But when we take a highly excited neuronal cell and we add CBD, we see a decrease in calcium. And this was very contrary in that what the researchers here expected, because usually we see with other agents, we see that if we add something and it causes calcium increase, whatever the basic condition is, we will see a calcium increase. And here we see that if we add it to normally baseline excited cells, we will see an increase. And on the other side, if we add it to a hyper-excited neuron, we will see a decrease. And this is something we see a lot of times with plant-derived molecules, that there is this adaptogenic function. It's not just in one direction, but it explains again what we're saying, that these molecules aim towards a homeostatic level. So if we're out of balance in this side, it will try to get it back into homeostasis. If we're out of balance in this side, it will do something differently to get us back into balance. And this is also one of the ways we can explain why CBD and other cannabinoids can have a different effect on different people, because it depends also on what kind of condition the cells, the body is when cannabinoids enter. Okay, so this was just to prove that this calcium spikes after cannabinoids are actually derived from the mitochondria and not from other sources inside of the cell, stating again that the mitochondria are crucially important in explaining how the cannabinoids function. And I'm sure you know that there are many diseases, there are many pathologies connected to the function of mitochondria. This is already well known in medicine. There are many diagnoses of the mitochondrial dysfunction. And here we can see also that in this case, in the case of the endocannabinoid system and cannabinoids and their function in our bodies, the mitochondria are crucially important. And it was also found that CBD has a very preventive role in the mitochondria. So there's a lot of metabolitic pathways happening in the mitochondria, and there's a lot of oxidative stress in the mitochondria. And in these experiments, very different inhibitors of the mitochondrial function, of the oxidative stress were added to the mitochondria, and then CBD was added, and they looked at if the CBD can confer protection against these blockers, against these molecules that induce changes or prevent the mitochondria from functioning properly. And it was actually found that in many cases CBD has a very highly protective role in the function of the mitochondria. So even if we are not in perfect cellular balance, CBD can help maintain a proper function of the mitochondria, giving the cell the possibility to produce enough energy to sustain a viable and a healthy cell. Okay, so this all gives us an idea that when we're talking about the endocannabinoid system, we have to broaden our perspective way beyond the 2 cannabinoid receptors, the 2 endocannabinoids and the few enzymes, but that the picture of what cannabinoids do is far more complex. They have very broad spectrum of molecular targets, and the way we do in science, when we can't explain everything, we call it OMS something. So when we didn't know how to explain the gazillion microbes in our gut, we called it microbiome. And similarly, a postulation has been formed that the endocannabinoid system is such a complex system that has the endocannabinoids are so they have so many molecular targets, and the way they function in our body is very complex that you can't explain it very simply. So let's call it endocannabinoidome. So this is like a total sum of everything that happens in our body that has to do with the receptors, with other molecular targets, with enzymes, and the endocannabinoids. So this is just to give you an idea that when we're talking about this, we really have to broaden our perspective beyond these few receptors. And similarly, it's also now postulated that the phytocannabinoids, which will be discussed in further detail later, also have many more functions than just through receptors, and not only cannabinoid receptors, other receptors, and not only receptors, but also completely independent of receptors, and that this also should be called phytocannabinoidome, because it is far more complex than we can explain with a single target. So I'm coming to a close of my lecture. So we see that even a single cell is quite complicated and for me highly fascinating. And that when we take a look at a whole body and have a look at a system that is actually embedded in every single cell in our body and kind of always goes towards the homeostatic level, we see a very complex picture. But nonetheless, that it's complex, it's always about homeostasis. And if we want to have a healthy body, we have to give the cells the opportunity to function in homeostatic levels. And cannabinoids can be of extreme importance and extreme help in these cases. Like already Dr. Meshulam said, that the phytocannabinoids are one of these neglected molecules that actually, I think that in the future will give us a huge insight into how our bodies are functioning and how we can help them maintain health and return health in case it's... I will go. Okay, thank you very much.
But for those who have some questions, please.
My name is Tamara Lach. I'm working on cancer and cannabinoids, and here I would really support your message that mitochondria and activity and healthy mitochondria are crucial also for development of cancer. Mm-hmm. And this may be another pathway of how cannabinoids like CBD protects or maybe even cures cancer cells.
Yeah, it was actually shown in many experiments that cannabinoids actually, if we take a typical mitochondria, it will reduce the production of ATP, and especially in cancerous cells, this is very important. And this reduction in ATP production can stop or can slow down the rate of growth of tumors. So this is, I also find this very important for future research.
I'm Dusan Nulima, a researcher, public health, epidemiology. So my role in this field is mostly to link the practice, research, policy and practice. So as you know, in epidemiology and public health, we are mostly concerned about the side effects of phytocannabinoids. So we have this term neuroadaptation. You didn't talk anything about neuroadaptation, and that means, very simplistically said, means that when we are adding phytocannabinoids to the system, our system adapts and stop producing the endocannabinoids in a way, though there are probably dysfunctions on this level of endocannabinoids. That's why we are giving phytocannabinoids. But anyway, can you talk, a little bit, maybe how this neuroadaptation, what is the role of neuroadaptation in this physiological system that you explained so clearly?
Cannabinoids are molecules, phytocannabinoids are molecules that when they come into our bodies know exactly what to do with them, because they're very similar to our own cannabinoids. And the idea is that even phytocannabinoids, when they come into our bodies, they aim to bring us more towards balance. And even very long-term users, because there's a huge group of, in some countries more, in some countries less, when there's a really prolonged 20-30-year-old use of cannabinoids, and the only thing that was found in these people is that they have a down-regulated production of cannabinoid receptors, not cannabinoids themselves, but the cannabinoid receptors. So basically what it happens is that our body thinks that there's so many cannabinoids all around that we don't need that many receptors to sense the changes. They're everywhere anyhow. So, and even in people where this happened, and there was a 20 or 30 year long use, when they ceased to take cannabinoids for 3 days, the production of receptors restarted. And in a few days, the body started producing receptors again, and the density grew. So actually, there's definitely something in terms of neuroadaptation happening, but we also don't see these typical adverse effects in adult use. Of course, it depends also a lot on frequency and the concentration of THC primarily, and what is actually the biggest challenge are the synthetical cannabinoids that are present more and more on the black market that have really, really strong and long-term adverse effects. And this is what is actually, this concentration of THC plus the synthetic and other pollutants that are present is actually the biggest threat. And this is once again the reason why we have to regulate this field, because patients, it is unacceptable that patients have to go to gray, black and other colored markets to get their medication.